It's pretty easy to beat your opponent at chess if they think they're playing checkers. Imagine if they didn't even know what chess was. They'd never heard of it before, and even if someone gave them a rule book, that rule book was written in a language that they didn't understand. All they would see is a seemingly familiar black and white board. They would assume that they knew what was going on, and then they would lose. While the average man or woman today may be vaguely aware of terms like promissory note and bill of exchange, the true nature of what these instruments are and how they function in our contemporary system has been gradually and deliberately removed over the course of hundreds of years from the awareness of the general public. If that sounds grandiose, take a moment to consider what you might be able to buy and control if you had the ability to create money out of nothing on a worldwide scale for centuries. And so it is today that even those who work in fields which directly interact with these instruments are predominantly not taught the underlying principles and dynamics. But if the system really runs on these instruments, surely the multitude of people who work in finance, for example, and the lawyers who they call when they're unsure of what to do, must also be initiated into the nature of how these things really work. Not necessarily. For example, on a construction site like this, how many of these workers actually need to know or understand the master plan for this structure? Very few. Almost everybody here only needs to know what their particular role is, what is expected of them, and who to talk to when they're unsure of what to do next. And what would it benefit the owners of this structure for their workers to know any more than this? Likewise, today's specialized labor force is comprised of workers who are trained to memorize procedure rather than to understand core principles, and especially not to understand how those core principles connect to other disciplines and the broader system as a whole. Law, business, and medical schools, as prestigious as they may appear, are all ultimately owned and controlled by someone. And if that someone doesn't want certain things on the curriculum or in the tests, then those students won't learn those things. These students then go on to become lawyers, business people, bankers, and doctors who still don't know those things. And in fact, they may not even know that those things exist. Just like on the construction site, if there was a point of control, then from its point of view, it's actually a good thing if most lawyers are unaware of how the system really works, as long as most judges are. Judges form a much smaller group of people who can be specifically screened, potentially compromised, and put through special training before they're specifically selected to take on their roles. They are the adults in the room in a court setting, and along with entrained reverence from lawyers and entrained fear and ignorance from the general public, their role generally provides them the ability to, in a sense, stage manage court proceedings. In this way, the rules of the game can be hidden in plain sight. But what rules? Exactly. According to bills of exchange acts around the world, the law merchant, which is never mentioned to the general public and which law students are taught is either redundant or a myth, apparently continues to apply today. In the Uniform Commercial Code, the modern codification of commercial law in the United States, it explicitly states that this code must be liberally construed and applied. Again, this is very vague and expansive legal terminology from presumably very experienced lawyers who are notoriously specific when it's in their interest to be. The code also states that this liberal interpretation and application is to promote the UCC's underlying purposes, one of which is to make uniform the law among the various jurisdictions. But which various jurisdictions? The lawyers who wrote this apparently forgot to mention or decided not to. If you read these documents carefully, this might be starting to sound like the sort of thing that could be interpreted to apply to you. Unfortunately, the UCC and these various acts appear to be deliberately written to be confusing and contradictory. In order then for us to understand and recognize how these ancient merchant rules could be being applied today to take advantage of an ignorant public, we first need to get a sense of how these rules were supposed to work originally in their proper context. And with that, let's finally now look at an instrument that you were never taught about, that happens to be uniquely well suited to manipulation and misrepresentation in our modern system. Generally speaking, unlike promissory notes, which are created as a two-party instrument written by the maker and collectible by the payee, bills of exchange are a two- or three-party instrument. Also, on a bill of exchange, the writer or drawer of the bill is not the debtor. These instruments are therefore much more flexible and, as we will see later, easier to disguise in contexts that the layman will likely not recognize. While mainstream modern descriptions of bills of exchange tend to characterize these instruments as involving orders being made to banks as intermediaries, traditionally this was not necessary. A bill was created by a merchant and passed to and between other merchants without any need for banks whatsoever. It is important to remember when considering the following examples that these merchants were quite literally in a class of their own. Just like the clergy or the nobility of the time, these merchants were a well-defined and exclusive group. These men generally knew each other or were aware of each other's reputations, and becoming a merchant was not something accessible to the average man or woman. Merchant status was almost always passed down generationally, father to son, along with the substantial training and knowledge required to operate around the world across different goods, currencies, cultures, and political climates in the capacity of a merchant. It is this process and practice of using bills of exchange among the merchant class in the Middle Ages, rather than some watered-down modern definition of this, that we will be exploring here. Let's cast our minds back several hundred years, and to take a simplified example, imagine a jacket merchant, who we will call James Jacket. James wants to buy some wool so that he can produce some jackets for sale, but he doesn't currently have the appropriate quantity of silver on hand to pay for it. James is confident, however, that as long as he can get the wool, by the time he's produced the jackets a month later, he will not have a problem recouping enough silver from his customers to cover the cost of that wool, along with a healthy profit margin for himself. Given this, let's assume that a local wool merchant, who we will call William Wool, was willing and trusted James Jacket, and as such, he would likely accept payment for his wool in the form of a bill of exchange. Let's look at a definition. A bill of exchange is an unconditional order in writing, addressed by one person to another, signed by the person giving it, requiring the person to whom it is addressed to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future time a sum certain in money to or to the order of a specified person or to bearer. Before we go into the specifics of the procedure, terminology, and paperwork, let's zoom out and see how this transaction might work in a more general sense first. James Jacket signs and accepts William Wool's bill of exchange, essentially an agreement, to pay 100 ounces of silver in 60 days' time in exchange for receiving 100 pounds of wool now. Practically speaking, this document functions as a 60-day loan from William Wool to James Jacket for the value of the wool. Said another way, William Wool is allowing James Jacket to purchase the wool from him on credit. So James takes his wool, goes back to his workshop, and starts producing a batch of jackets for sale to his regular customers. They will pay him for the final products in the form of physical silver. After 60 days has elapsed, William Wool knows that he's entitled to show up and present the bill of exchange to James Jacket at a designated location and demand full payment of the 100 ounces of physical silver. In this case, James Jacket makes good on his word and hands over the silver. The bill of exchange is ripped up and the two merchants are square. James was able to profit on a batch of jackets that he otherwise couldn't afford to produce, and William was able to sell more wool than he might have otherwise. Everyone's happy and they go about their day. But what if James had not paid? In a case like this, William might have gone to the local merchant authorities, and James may have had his assets stripped by a vigilante group comprised of other merchants, followed by a tour around town in a cart of manure. For James, without the benefit of credibility within the merchant community and the means to operate on credit, his capacity to function as a merchant and grow fantastically wealthy might have been over for good. For these reasons, William should have felt confident in being able to trust James's word and thus be willing to extend the credit to him in the first place. Let's rewind a little bit. What if sometime during the 60 days, before the bill had matured, that is, before the time James was obligated to pay, William wanted to use these future funds for his own purposes? Let's say William wanted to buy some more lambs to increase his wool production capacity. He might go to Larry Lamb, a lamb breeder, and inquire as to whether Larry was familiar with a guy called James Jacket. If Larry had heard of James and knew him to have an upstanding reputation, he may well accept James's bill of exchange from William, in exchange handing William 10 lambs that day. Given that Larry trusts William's word, and possibly James's, he knows that as soon as the original 60 days has elapsed and James's bill has matured, Larry can go and collect on the 100 ounces of silver from James, just as William would have done himself. Of course, just as we've seen in previous examples, there's no guarantee that this bill of exchange will ever actually be collected upon. Larry might spend James's bill to buy a ton of animal feed from Graham Grain, who uses it to buy farming supplies or a plow horse, and so on and so on. Merchants then may travel overseas and continue to pass James's bill around indefinitely, with James never indeed needing to hand over a single silver coin for that original transaction. If this was the case, then practically speaking, James would have gotten 100 pounds of wool for free. Of course, in theory, James would always need to keep the silver on hand in case one day some merchant did show up and demand it, but it is indeed quite possible that that day would never come. So now that we've seen an overview of a typical traditional merchant interaction, let's run through the same scenario again in a little more detail and using some of the specific terminology. Here are a few other definitions to help get us started. The person who draws the bill, that is, he literally draws out the document contents with a pen and who also gives the order to pay, is called the drawer. The person upon whom the bill is drawn and who is ordered to pay is called the drawee. The person specified in the bill as the person to be paid is called the payee, and the person in possession of the bill is the bearer. So a bill of exchange comprises of the drawer ordering the drawee to pay a certain amount to the payee. A orders B to pay C. This sounds simple enough, but just to make things a little more confusing, a common practice was actually for the drawer and the payee to be the same person. In other words, the drawer A is writing an order for the drawee B to pay the payee C, where C is actually also A. This will become clearer as we return to our example of the merchants James Jacket and William Wool. Let's do that now. Practically speaking, James Jacket, as a wealthy clothier with a business to run, would likely not have had the time to wander around town himself, getting quotes on wool and negotiating with individual suppliers at a merchant fair. Instead, he would generally have had at least one full-time assistant operating as an agent on his behalf. That assistant would be given authority to travel around and do business in James's stead, within certain parameters. Remember that without modern communication and transportation, there would be no convenient way for James's assistant to check in with him and confirm if a deal was acceptable in real time. So the assistant would need the authority to close deals and negotiate terms of credit on his own. In our example, James might instruct his assistant that he is to find up to 100 pounds of wool above a certain quality grade, which is being sold below a certain cost per pound and which can be paid for on credit at a minimum of 60 days payment terms. If the assistant finds a merchant selling wool that matches this criteria, he's authorized by James to close the deal. But how would James have written out and signed the bill of exchange to give to his assistant, since it would be impossible to know the terms of the deal ahead of time? Well, those of us of a certain age might remember being sent to the store by their mother with a blank check to go and buy groceries. Since your mother didn't know what the total would be, she would pre-sign the check and possibly fill in the name of the grocery store and send you off with a shopping list. This way, the store clerk could just fill out the total themselves at the cash register and the check would be completed and valid for the store to receive as payment. The child at the grocery store is in a similar position to James Jacket's assistant. James doesn't know the details that will need to be filled out, but he can pre-approve the bill of exchange before that assistant leaves to travel to the merchant fair. This can literally be as simple as James signing a blank piece of paper and handing it to his assistant to take to the market. In commercial terms, by doing this, James has pre-accepted the bill as the drawee, that is, the one who is being ordered to pay, though the bill has of course not yet been filled out and completed. Once James's assistant arrives at the fair and finds an appropriate wool merchant, in this case William Wool, he will negotiate the terms of the deal as per James's instructions. Here, William Wool will take the bill, which currently only contains James's signature, and fill out the rest of it as per his agreement with James's assistant. William, as the drawer of the bill, will put a location at the top of the page, noting where the bill is due to be paid. He will put a sum certain at the top in numerals of the amount owed, and he will write an order in words telling James Jacket to pay himself, William Wool the payee, the agreed amount, now written in words, at a certain date. It's worth noting, as per the Bills of Exchange Acts around the world which are still in effect to this day, a bill of exchange really only needs to contain 4 elements to be valid: a date, 2 names, an order to pay a sum certain, that is, an exact amount, and a signature. From here, William Wool is now the holder of and payee on a bill of exchange, drawn on James Jacket for 100 ounces of silver, James being the drawee and acceptor of that bill. Remember that James did the accepting on a blank sheet of paper before the rest of the bill was even written. So, with completed bill in hand, William will now release the 100 pounds of wool to James's assistant, who will return home with it so James can get his workers started on the production of jackets. After 60 days, once the bill has matured, William will likely send his assistant with James's bill to go and collect the silver from James himself. This is called a presentment for payment. The bill is literally being physically presented to the drawee so they can make payment. If James comes up with the silver, then all is fine and the bill can be ripped up and everyone is square. If James fails to pay upon presentment, then he has dishonoured the bill. William, at this point, will protest that dishonour and involve a notary to formalise and put James's dishonouring of the bill on the public record. At this point, as mentioned previously, James could be in a whole bunch of trouble with the merchant vigilante groups and might find himself riding around town in a manure cart. Alternatively, if William Wool should decide to use James's bill sometime before the 60 days has elapsed as payment on another transaction, this is called negotiating the bill. Again, in this context, negotiation does not mean to haggle or argue over price, but rather to transfer the bill from one person to another. In this case, William would endorse the bill with his own signature, not unlike you may have done with a check in the past, and then put someone else's name below that signature. Since William is the payee, if he wants to use the bill to buy 10 lambs from Larry Lamb, he can just sign his own name somewhere on the bill and put Larry Lamb's name underneath, and then deliver the bill to Larry in exchange for the lambs. William could also just sign his own name without Larry's underneath as an open endorsement, which would mean that whoever he passes the bill to could collect on it as the holder of the bill, even if their name didn't appear anywhere on the bill. Now, William has gone from being the payee to the endorser, since he has just endorsed the bill, and Larry is now the endorsee and holder of the bill and entitled to go and collect the 100 ounces of silver from James' jacket once the original 60 days has elapsed. If we want to get specific, Larry is actually the holder in due course, since he has exchanged value for the bill as opposed to stealing or finding it, and the bill has not yet matured or been dishonored, as far as he knows. From here, as we've covered, Larry may decide to go and collect silver from James, or he may decide to negotiate the bill himself to Graham Grain for some animal feed, which would make Larry another endorser and Graham the endorsee and holder of the bill, and so on, and so on, and so on.